I pulled up a Saas benchmark report at midnight last year because a number on my own dashboard scared me, and I needed to know one thing fast. Was this an actual problem, or just how a business like mine normally behaves? I run a handful of small online businesses, a proxy service, a couple of research and data tools, nothing venture backed, nobody on a board asking me to hit a growth curve or report to. Every month I sit down with my own churn, my own revenue, my own retention numbers, and I check them against whatever's been published, so none of what follows is theory to me. It's the same spreadsheet I open before I decide whether to actually worry. Here's why I bother comparing myself to a published median at all, instead of just trusting my own gut. A number by itself doesn't tell you anything. 6% monthly churn sounds alarming until you learn that cheap, self-serve subscription products commonly sit right around there, while businesses locked into annual contracts often churn far less than that. The same 6% can be fine for one kind of business and a 5-alarm fire for another. Without something to compare against, every metric is just a number floating in space, with no way to know if it's actually bad or perfectly ordinary. So that's what I want to walk through today, where these benchmark numbers actually come from, why the reports lean on median instead of average, what a benchmark can honestly tell you, what it can't, and the specific ways I've seen people, myself included, misread it. Start with where the numbers come from. Most public SaaS benchmark reports get built from a pool of companies that agreed to hand over their own data, usually through a survey, a billing platform's aggregate numbers, or a venture firm reviewing its own portfolio companies. Notice what that already tells you. The sample is self-selected. A company doing badly, quietly shrinking or shutting down, is a lot less likely to fill out a survey than one having a good year, so the pool skews toward companies willing to look good in public. Companies willing to share their churn and revenue with a research firm are not a random slice of every SaaS business that exists. That pool also skews toward a certain size and stage of company. A lot of these reports lean heavily on venture-funded growth stage businesses because those are the companies filling out the surveys, and because plenty of these reports are put together by firms whose actual job is serving that exact audience either as future clients or future investments. A solo operator running a small tool out of a spare bedroom almost never shows up in that data at all, which matters a great deal if that solo operator happens to be you. And SaaS itself is a massive, messy category to begin with. A benchmark that blends together a $9 a month tool sold to freelancers and a $90,000 a year enterprise platform sold through a sales team is going to spit out a median that doesn't really describe either one of them well. Those two businesses have different customers, different sales cycles, different reasons people cancel, different support expectations, and mashing them into one number hides more than it reveals, no matter how confidently the report presents it. None of that makes benchmarks useless. It just means the number you're reading describes a specific population, not some law of nature. Before I compare anything of mine to a published figure, I try to find out who was actually in that sample, what pricing tier, what customer type, what stage of company, roughly how many companies it's even built from, and whether the methodology section says anything at all about how they were recruited. If the report doesn't say, I treat the number as a rough compass heading, not a precise target to hit. If you've read more than one of these reports, you've probably noticed they almost always report the median, never the average, and that's a deliberate choice worth actually understanding rather than skimming past. Metrics like churn, revenue growth, and customer acquisition cost tend to have long tails. Most companies cluster somewhere in a normal range, but a handful of outliers doing exceptionally well or falling apart can drag an average way off center and make the whole dataset lie to you about what's typical. Picture 100 companies in a sample. If 98 of them sit around 40% annual churn, and 2 of them show 400% because they're actively liquidating and losing customers by the truckload on the way out, the average gets pulled upward in a way that describes nobody in that group. Anyone reading just that average would think the typical company in the sample is in far worse shape than it actually is, and would make decisions based on a number that describes almost nobody in the room. The median sidesteps that problem entirely. Line every company up in order from lowest to highest and take the one sitting in the middle, and a handful of extreme outliers can't drag it anywhere. That's why median is the more honest number for describing what a typical company in the dataset actually looks like. And it's also why I get a little more skeptical whenever a report leads with an average instead of a median without explaining why it made that choice. Used carefully, a benchmark is good for exactly one thing, telling you whether a number is unusual for your category. That's genuinely useful on its own, and it applies whether we're talking about churn, revenue growth, or what you're paying to acquire a customer. If your monthly churn is sitting at 15% and the published median for your type of product is closer to 3 or 5%, that's a real signal worth chasing down, even if the sample behind that report isn't a perfect match for your business. Directionally, something looks off, and that's worth your attention, regardless of how imperfect the comparison is. Benchmarks are also good at catching your own blind spots. When you only ever look at your own numbers over time, you lose your sense of what's normal versus what's alarming, because you get used to whatever you've been living with, good or bad, month after month. A median from outside your own bubble breaks that tunnel vision, the same way talking to another operator in your space recalibrates your sense of normal. Not because you're copying what they do, just because you needed a second reference point that isn't your own history quietly talking back to you. Here's the part that gets skipped, and it's the part I care about most. A benchmark cannot tell you why your number is what it is. If your churn sits above the median, the report won't tell you whether that's confusing onboarding, pricing that's attracting the wrong customers, a support experience that's letting people down, or you simply being in a naturally higher churn category, like a seasonal product or a trial-heavy one where people expect to come and go. You still have to go dig through your own cohorts, your support tickets, your cancellation reasons, one by one to find the actual cause. The benchmark only tells you where to start looking. Nothing more than that. It also can't account for your specific business model, even inside the same broad category. A one-person tool selling to solo freelancers for a few dollars a month is going to have a completely different churn profile and a completely different acceptable acquisition cost than a company selling multi-year contracts to mid-sized businesses through a sales team, even if both get labeled Saas in the same report. Compare your solo self-serve product against a benchmark built mostly from funded, sales-led companies, and you'll spend real time chasing a number that was never realistic for your situation to begin with. And a benchmark definitely cannot tell you what's good enough for your own goals. Median just means half the sample sits above it and half sits below it. It says nothing about whether the median company in that sample is actually healthy, profitable, or sustainable, only that it's in the middle of the pack. I've watched founders treat beating the median as the finish line, when the real question is always whether the business supports what you're personally trying to build at whatever pace and scale that actually takes for you and nobody else. So here's what I actually do with a benchmark in practice. Roughly the same steps every single time I pull one up. First, I look for the closest matching segment I can find, a cut of the data by pricing tier or business size that's nearest to mine, instead of just grabbing whatever top-line number happens to be easiest to find on the first page of the report. Second, I treat it as a range, not a line. Instead of asking whether I'm above or below the median down to the decimal, I ask whether I'm in the same rough neighborhood as that number, or clearly off in one direction by a wide margin that's hard to explain away. Third, I use it to prioritize, not to diagnose. If a number of mine sits well outside the typical range, that tells me where to spend my next hour of digging around in my own data. It doesn't tell me what I'll actually find when I get there, and I try hard not to assume the answer before I've actually looked. Fourth, I recheck my own trend before I even bother comparing outward at all. A number that's been moving in the wrong direction for the last 3 months matters more to me than where it sits against some external median, because my own trend carries context a benchmark will never have access to, since it's built entirely from my own history and nobody else's. That last point is really the whole lesson here. A benchmark is a sanity check on your own data. It is not a replacement for looking at your own data closely, and it never will be. I still track my own churn, conversion and retention cohort by cohort, month over month, because that record is the one that actually reflects my business and nobody else's. The median just helps me tell whether an unusual month is genuinely unusual or just an ordinary Tuesday for a company built the way mine is, small, self-funded, and running on my own schedule. If you're building the habit of watching your own metrics closely in the first place, that's the foundation everything else here sits on top of. A benchmark is a supplement to that habit, never a substitute for it. And to be clear, I'm not a financial advisor. None of this is financial, investment, or tax advice. It's just how I personally read a number before I decide whether to act on it in my own businesses. And your situation is going to have its own specifics, mine doesn't. So treat everything here as a starting point for your own thinking, not a rule to follow blindly. Every one of these explainers lives in writing at dataresearchanalysiscollection.com, the whole metric library, in plain English, if you want to go deeper on any one piece of this. Every metric is explained in writing at dataresearchanalysiscollection.com. So go take a look, and if this kind of plain explanation of business numbers is useful to you, subscribe for the next one.